What happens when a government wins every vote on paper, but millions of people stop believing in the future it is asking them to defend? In Moscow, a political party that openly called for peace was pushed off the ballot, and supporters gathered outside the Supreme Court as police moved in. If you want clear, responsible coverage of the pressure building inside Russia, tap like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who wants facts instead of dramatic rumors. The headline says 120 million Russians have rejected Vladimir Putin's war. That sounds like a single, overwhelming uprising. But the real story is more complicated and, in some ways, more important. There's no reliable evidence that 120 million Russians have publicly rejected the war. Russia has a population of roughly 140 million, and measuring public opinion inside an authoritarian system is difficult. People may fear answering honestly. Some support negotiations, but not a retreat. Others support the war in principle while opposing its cost. Many may simply want the fighting to stop without believing the Kremlin is responsible. So this is not a story about one confirmed number. It is a story about pressure. The pressure can be seen in courtrooms, election rules, polling data, fuel prices, family conversations, and the growing distance between official television and ordinary life. It can also be seen in the government's response. When a regime feels completely secure, it usually does not need to remove even a small legal opposition party weeks before an election. When it feels pressure, it often tries to control the appearance of disagreement before disagreement becomes organized. That is the central tension inside Russia today. The Kremlin wants the country to look united, but unity created by fear is different from unity created by belief. A silent population may look loyal until a personal loss, an economic shock, or a political mistake gives people a reason to speak at the same time. The recent confrontation around Yabloko offered a rare glimpse of that possibility. Yabloko is a long-standing liberal political party in Russia. It has opposed the invasion of Ukraine and has argued for negotiations and a political alternative. It is not a mass movement capable of taking power overnight. It does not control the streets, the television networks, or the major institutions of the state. But it has something that is increasingly unusual in Russia: legal recognition combined with an open anti-war position. That distinction is crucial. Opposition voices inside Russia have not disappeared completely. They have been pushed abroad, placed under legal pressure, labeled as foreign agents, imprisoned, or forced into silence. Independent journalists continue to work, often from outside the country. Activists communicate through encrypted channels. Families discuss the war privately. But the space for organized opposition inside the formal political system has become extremely narrow. A party on a ballot is different from a message on the internet. A party can gather signatures, nominate candidates, hold meetings, distribute literature, and turn private frustration into a public choice. Even if it wins very few seats, it can give voters a visible place to put their anger. That is why the removal of Yabloko became more than a technical election dispute. Supporters saw it as the closing of one of the last legal doors through which anti-war Russians could express themselves. The legal argument involved campaign materials, funding, and accusations connected to Russia's expanding extremism laws. Supporters of the party called the case politically motivated. The Supreme Court ultimately barred Yabloko from participating in the federal contest, and an appeal was rejected on August 17, 2026, according to reporting by the Moscow Times and other outlets. The Moscow Times. The government's supporters could describe the decision as a matter of illegal compliance. The party's supporters saw a pattern. Every time an organization becomes capable of gathering discontent, the rules change around it. That perception can be politically powerful even when the original legal case is complicated. On August 17th, people gathered outside the Supreme Court in Moscow as the appeal was considered. Reports said dozens were detained. Other coverage described hundreds of supporters rallying after the party was excluded from the election. The exact number varied between reports, and images from a protest cannot always establish how many people were present or how long they remained. But the scene carried a clear message. The decision had moved the conflict from legal paperwork into public space. Deutsche Welle. The police response was not unusual by Russian standards. Barriers appeared. Officers surrounded the area. Protesters were placed on buses. Among those reportedly detained were party members and supporters, including senior figures. The act of detention does not prove that a nationwide revolt has begun. It does show how quickly even a limited gathering can be treated as a security problem. That is the first clue to understanding Moscow's fear. The Kremlin does not need to believe that millions will march tomorrow. It only needs to believe that a small legal network could become a meeting point for many different grievances. An anti-war voter may be angry about conscription. A pensioner may be angry about prices. A business owner may be angry about sanctions. A student may be angry about censorship. These people may not agree on a new political system, but they may agree that the current system has made their lives harder. Political movements often begin with agreement on what must stop, not agreement on what should come next. That is why authoritarian governments are so sensitive to independent organization. Private frustration is difficult to control, but often remains private. Organization gives it memory, leadership, symbols, and timing. A party name can become a signal, a court date can become a gathering point. A rejected appeal can become proof that the normal system will not listen. The Kremlin's answer has been to shape the election before voters enter the polling booth. Russia's State Duma election is scheduled for September 18th through 2026. The parliament has 450 seats. Under the electoral system, some deputies are elected through party lists and others through single-member districts. That structure creates two different battles. Parties must survive the national contest, while individual candidates must survive local registration and campaigning. Removing a party from the federal ballot does not erase every anti-war candidate, but it makes coordination far more difficult. Voters may still find independent or local candidates, yet those candidates do not have the same national platform, party machinery, or media visibility. In a tightly managed system, fragmentation can be as effective as suppression. The message to voters becomes simple. You may disagree, but you will not necessarily be given a common place to express it. This is where electronic voting enters the debate. Digital systems can make voting easier and faster, especially across a country as large as Russia, but critics argue that opaque electronic voting makes independent verification more difficult. If observers cannot see how ballots are processed, they must trust the institutions controlling the software, the servers, and the reporting process. Trust is the real issue. Even a technically secure system can lose legitimacy if people believe the rules are designed to produce a predetermined result. Once that belief spreads, every official number is judged against suspicion. A ruling party can win by a large margin, yet the result may not persuade those who believe the competition was never fair. That creates a strange form of political instability. The government may control the result and still fail to control the narrative. If you are watching this because of the phrase 120 million Russians, keep that number in perspective. It should not be presented as a verified count of anti-war citizens. The more defensible conclusion is that millions of Russians may be experiencing different forms of war fatigue, while only a fraction can express it openly. Like this video if you value careful context, subscribe for more evidence-based political analysis, and share it so the difference between a claim and a confirmed fact does not disappear in the noise. Polling inside Russia shows why the situation cannot be reduced to a simple yes or no question. Some Levada Center surveys have reported that a majority of respondents support the actions of the Russian armed forces. Other surveys have found rising support for negotiations or a desire to end the fighting. These results can appear contradictory because they measure different things. A respondent may say the army is acting correctly while also saying negotiations should begin. Another may support peace only if Russia keeps the territory it has occupied. A third may want the war to end but fear the consequences of defeat. Public opinion during wartime is rarely clean. People answer according to emotion, identity, information, and personal risk. Someone with a son at the front may describe the war differently from someone who sees it only on television. A worker in a defense factory may benefit economically from military production while worrying about inflation. A family receiving compensation after a soldier's death may depend on the state and resent the conflict at the same time. If this story is helping you see past the headline, press like so more viewers can find it. Subscribe for the next part of the investigation, and share this episode with someone who follows Russian politics. Support for the state is not always support for the war. This distinction helps explain why the Kremlin can maintain high approval ratings while also becoming more repressive. Many people may prefer stability to uncertainty. They may not want Putin replaced if they believe replacement could bring chaos, economic collapse, or another round of violence. Others may not trust any alternative leader. Some may believe the official story. Some may know it is incomplete, but decide that open resistance is too dangerous. Fear can produce silence without producing loyalty. A poll conducted under pressure cannot reveal everything people think, but trends still matter. When more respondents say negotiations are necessary, when support for continuing military operations declines, or when people place greater emphasis on daily problems, the government has to work harder to keep the war at the center of national identity. The Kremlin has tried to do exactly that. The ruling United Russia Party has presented the war as a test of national strength. Veterans have been promoted as candidates. Military service is treated as a source of political legitimacy. Campaign images connect loyalty to patriotism and patriotism to support for the state. The argument is not simply that the war is necessary. It is that questioning the war means questioning the country itself. That is a powerful message in a society shaped by memories of invasion, sacrifice, and national humiliation. But it has a weakness. A war framed as a historic mission can be difficult to end without admitting failure. If the government tells people that victory is essential to survival, every compromise may look like betrayal. Leaders become trapped by their own language. The longer the war continues, the more expensive it becomes to explain why the promised breakthrough has not arrived. For families, the debate is much more direct. They ask why relatives are being sent back to the front. They ask why wounded soldiers return with limited support. They ask why prices rise while officials talk about victory. They ask why the government can find money for missiles, but not for hospitals, schools, roads, or reliable services. These questions do not automatically create revolution. Most people do not become activists simply because they are unhappy. They adapt, they cut expenses, they look for additional work, they move to another city, they avoid political conversations, they try to keep their children safe. But adaptation has limits. War economies can hide weakness for a surprisingly long time. Military spending creates jobs, raises wages in certain sectors, and gives the impression of growth. Factories receive state contracts. Soldiers receive payments. Regions connected to defense production may see money flowing in. Official unemployment can remain low even while the civilian economy becomes less dynamic. The problem is what happens underneath those numbers. Workers are pulled from civilian industries into defense plants. Skilled young people leave the country or avoid long-term commitments. Technology becomes harder to obtain. Investment moves toward military needs. Inflation reduces the value of wages. Imported components become more expensive. Small businesses struggle to access credit. A country can report growth while families feel poorer. This is why economic statistics must be interpreted carefully. Gross domestic product can rise because the state is spending heavily on weapons. That does not mean household welfare is improving. A missile factory may add to national output, but it does not replace a functioning civilian supply chain. A large defense contract may keep a town employed, but it may also tie the town's survival to a war that cannot continue forever. The Kremlin has built a system that can absorb pressure, but absorption is not the same as recovery. The war has also changed Russia's demographic future. Military deaths and injuries have affected younger working-age men. Emigration has removed professionals in technology, finance, engineering, and medicine. Falling birth rates, already a serious problem before the invasion, have become harder to reverse. A country can replace equipment faster than it can replace an entire generation. That loss is not always visible on television. There is no single image of demographic decline. It appears in empty classrooms, delayed marriages, understaffed hospitals, closed businesses, and families who no longer plan beyond the next month. It appears when employers compete for workers and when factories recruit far from home. It appears when a parent realizes that the future they imagine for their child has become uncertain. The war is therefore not only a military event, it is a pressure placed on the life cycle of the country, and pressure changes political behavior slowly until it changes suddenly. A government can survive on popular policies if the population believes those policies are temporary. It can survive hardship if people believe sacrifice has a clear purpose. It can survive censorship if people believe conditions will improve. But when sacrifice becomes permanent, purpose becomes unclear, and improvement never arrives, patience becomes less reliable. That is where the idea of a breaking point comes from. A breaking point is not necessarily one dramatic day when the capital falls silent and millions fill the streets. More often, it is the moment when enough people privately stop accepting the official explanation. The government may still function, the police may still disperse protests, the courts may still issue decisions, elections may still produce the expected winners, but the connection between authority and belief begins to weaken. Small acts become meaningful in that environment. Someone removes a campaign poster from an apartment entrance. Someone refuses to attend a patriotic rally. Someone shares a banned article through a private group. Someone tells a local official that a family member died because of the war. None of these acts alone can challenge the Kremlin. Together, they show that the state's message is no longer entering every home without resistance. A government cannot measure all private refusal. That uncertainty often produces more surveillance. Internet restrictions expand. Anti-war statements are punished. Foreign agent designations create financial and social pressure. Activists abroad may face threats to their documents or property. Families inside Russia may fear that a relative's online activity could bring consequences to everyone. Repression can prevent public mobilization. It can also make private anger more intense. The danger for the Kremlin is that repression removes peaceful outlets while leaving the underlying problems untouched. If people cannot vote for an anti-war party, they may not become more supportive of the war. They may simply conclude that formal politics is useless. If they cannot protest, they may withdraw from public life. If they cannot trust official institutions, they may rely on rumor, conspiracy, or informal networks. That is not stability, it is controlled uncertainty. The Yabloko case therefore matters even if the party itself is too small to defeat united Russia. Its exclusion changes what voters are allowed to see. It tells anti-war citizens that their position may exist in society, but not in the official political arena. It tells other parties that open opposition carries a cost. And it tells the public that the state would rather remove a difficult competitor than risk measuring its real support. That perception can become more powerful than the party's vote share. Before the court decision, some reports and political discussions suggested that Yabloko might attract a modest share of the vote nationally and a larger share in Moscow. Those figures should be treated cautiously, especially because polling in Russia is difficult and the party's support may not translate into actual seats. But even a small percentage can matter when the ruling system is trying to present complete consensus. In an authoritarian election, the question is often not whether the opposition can win. The question is whether it can demonstrate that the official result is not the same as public feeling. That is the demonstration the Kremlin wants to prevent. Moscow is especially sensitive because it is the country's political stage. A small protest in a distant region may receive little attention. A crowd outside the Supreme Court can be filmed, shared, and discussed across the country. The capital is where institutions, journalists, diplomats, and political elites watch one another. A protest there becomes a message to the people inside the system. It says that opposition has not disappeared. It says that legal decisions have consequences beyond the courtroom. It says that the state may control the streets, but it cannot completely control what citizens think about the streets. The authorities understand the power of images, too. Police lines, detention buses, and barriers can be used to show control. The same images can show fear. When officers surround a small group of elderly party members or young supporters, viewers may ask why such people are treated as a national security threat. Here's your checkpoint. A court ruling can remove a party from a ballot, but it cannot remove the reasons. People are frustrated. If you want more calm, clear analysis, subscribe, leave a thoughtful comment, and share this video. That question is difficult to erase. The answer is often that Russia is defending itself against foreign influence, extremism, or disorder. National security language can be broad enough to absorb almost any challenge. A court dispute becomes an attack on the state. A peace proposal becomes disloyalty. A complaint about prices becomes foreign propaganda. The more categories expand, the less space remains for ordinary disagreement. Yet public opinion is not a machine that can be permanently programmed. People can repeat official language in public while using completely different language at home. They can praise the army and still hope the war ends. They can vote for the ruling party and still blame the government for a relative's death. They can fear protest and still resent the police. This double life is common in authoritarian systems. It is also why sudden change can surprise observers. For years, a society may appear passive. Then, a triggering event connects separate frustrations. A mobilization order, a military defeat, a corruption scandal, or a leadership crisis can change the cost of staying silent. Once people believe others are ready to act, the fear of acting alone becomes weaker. But there is no guarantee that such a moment will arrive. The Kremlin has important strengths. It controls national television. It controls the security services. It controls the legal framework. It can offer money to loyal regions and punish institutions that cooperate with opponents. It can use the election process to create the appearance of competition without allowing a genuine transfer of power. It also benefits from opposition fragmentation. Some critics want peace, but not political change. Others want a democratic transition, but disagree about borders. Some oppose Putin, but support a harder line against Ukraine. Some live abroad and have lost contact with people inside the country. Others are exhausted, afraid, or unwilling to risk prison. A protest movement does not need only anger. It needs coordination, trust, leadership, and a credible future. That is why the phrase Moscow revolts may be too strong for the evidence available. A rally, even a large one, is not the same as a national uprising. Detentions do not prove that the regime is collapsing. Polls showing support for negotiations do not prove that most citizens are ready to challenge Putin. Economic stress does not automatically produce political change. The honest conclusion is more cautious. The Kremlin faces visible and growing strains, but it still possesses powerful tools for managing them. This distinction does not make the story less important. It makes the story more realistic. History is full of governments that looked stronger than they were and oppositions that looked weaker than they became. The key is not to predict a revolution from a single protest. The key is to watch whether different forms of pressure begin reinforcing one another. Does war fatigue connect with economic hardship? Does economic hardship connect with military losses? Do military losses connect with election anger? Does election anger connect with regional complaints? Do these grievances find a trusted organization? When those links form, a small event can become much larger. When they do not, the state may absorb each crisis separately. The September election will provide clues, but not a complete answer. If turnout is high and the ruling party wins comfortably, the Kremlin will present that as proof of support. If turnout is low, officials may blame apathy or logistical problems. If independent candidates perform better than expected in certain districts, the results may reveal local frustration even without changing the national balance. The numbers will matter, but the gaps will matter too. Look at where support falls. Look at where turnout changes. Look at regions with heavy military recruitment. Look at cities where fuel shortages or industrial layoffs are most visible. Look at whether authorities release detailed results or rely on broad national totals. Look at how quickly independent observers are silenced. Elections and managed systems often reveal pressure indirectly. They show what the government fears enough to ban. They show which topics are safe enough to discuss. They show where the state spends resources to control the narrative. They show whether citizens are willing to take even a small political risk, and the risk is real. Anti-war activism in Russia can lead to fines, dismissal, detention, or imprisonment. The law is not applied evenly, and a statement that appears harmless in one place can become evidence in another. This is why visible protest numbers should never be used as a simple measure of public opinion. People may oppose the war and still stay home because they are protecting their families. Silence can be a survival strategy. At the same time, survival strategies can accumulate into political withdrawal. If enough people decide that no legal action can change anything, the regime may win the election and lose the belief that politics has meaning. That is a long-term danger, because systems without legitimate feedback become more likely to make large mistakes. Leaders hear praise, not warnings. Officials hide bad news. Regional authorities exaggerate success. Military commanders report progress that does not exist. The center believes its own propaganda until reality becomes impossible to ignore. The war in Ukraine has already exposed that danger in different ways. Russia has shown the ability to mobilize resources, produce weapons, and absorb losses. It has also shown the cost of relying on secrecy, centralized decision-making, and loyalty over accuracy. The longer the conflict continues, the more difficult it becomes to hide the human and economic consequences from the families experiencing them directly. Every funeral creates a private political question. Every wounded veteran creates a question about the promise made to soldiers. Every canceled train, empty shelf, expensive repair, or missing worker turns a distant geopolitical argument into a daily experience. Propaganda can explain one problem. It struggles to explain thousands of unrelated problems that all point toward the same leadership. And that is why the Kremlin is fighting on two fronts. One front is in Ukraine, where Russia seeks military and political advantage. The other is inside Russia, where the government seeks to preserve the idea that the war remains necessary, controlled, and winnable. A battlefield setback can damage the domestic story. A domestic protest can weaken the battlefield story. The two fronts are connected. This is also why the removal of an anti-war party matters before the election. The government is not only protecting seats, it is protecting the narrative that there is no serious alternative to the war. If Yabloko had remained on the ballot, even a modest result could have shown that anti-war sentiment had a legal shape. By removing it, the Kremlin reduces the possibility of a single national number revealing the size of that sentiment. People may still disagree, but their disagreement is scattered across invalid ballots, abstention, local candidates, private conversations, and silence. Fragmented opposition is easier to manage than organized opposition. The question is whether fragmentation can last forever. Russia is a large country with different regions, languages, economies, and political cultures. Moscow does not experience the same reality as a remote industrial town. A family in a military recruiting region may see the war as an employer and a source of income. A family in a major city may see it as a barrier to travel, education, and personal freedom. A border region may experience drone attacks directly. Another region may see only television images. There is no single Russian public. That makes a national revolt harder to organize, but it also makes the Kremlin's promise of universal unity less convincing. Different groups may have different reasons to be angry. The government must respond to all of them while insisting that the country has one mind. The contradiction becomes sharper with every election. If the state claims that almost everyone supports the war, why remove the party calling for peace? If the election is genuinely competitive, why restrict the campaign space? If the country is stable, why treat a small gathering outside a courthouse as a security emergency? These questions may not overthrow a government, but they can change how people interpret its actions. A barrier becomes evidence of fear. A detention becomes evidence that the court decision was politically sensitive. A propaganda poster becomes something residents tear down after dark. A poll becomes a debate about whether respondents felt safe enough to tell the truth. The meaning of an event is shaped by the trust people already have in institutions. For Putin's system, the greatest long-term risk may not be an immediate mass uprising. It may be the slow loss of credibility among people who continue to obey but no longer believe. Such a system can remain in place for years. It can also become brittle. When an unexpected crisis arrives, there may be no trusted institution capable of absorbing it. Before we reach the final answer, help us keep this channel independent of sensational claims. Choose like, subscribe, and share if you want careful analysis that tells you what is confirmed, what is probable, and what still needs proof. The police can disperse a crowd. They cannot repair a broken social contract. The courts can remove a party. They cannot make voters believe the election is open. State television can repeat the word victory. It cannot make a family forget a missing son. A central bank can raise interest rates. It cannot create skilled workers overnight. A military factory can increase output. It cannot rebuild a lost generation. These are the limits of control, and yet the limits should not be confused with imminent collapse. Putin still has loyal elites, powerful security agencies, significant resources, and a population that may prioritize order over confrontation. The opposition remains divided. Many people who want peace do not support the opposition. Many who oppose the Kremlin do not agree on what should replace it. The system is under pressure, but pressure is not the same as breaking. The next few months will reveal which side of that distinction becomes more important. Watch the election rules. Watch regional protests over wages, fuel, and military payments. Watch whether veterans become a source of loyalty or a source of criticism. Watch whether officials begin blaming one another for economic problems. Watch whether independent voices inside the system become more outspoken. Most importantly, watch what the government chooses to censor. Censorship is a map of fear. The topics targeted most aggressively are often the topics capable of connecting private complaints. A single anti-war slogan may be less threatening than a discussion linking casualties, inflation, corruption, and election fraud. A lone critic may be manageable. A network of local complaints is much harder to contain. That is why the language of extremism has become so useful to authoritarian power. It turns political competition into a security issue. Once opponents are defined as dangerous rather than merely wrong, extraordinary measures appear normal. But political labels can also lose their power. If too many ordinary people are called extremists, the word stops distinguishing genuine threats from peaceful disagreement. Families begin to see the law not as protection, but as a weapon pointed at anyone who becomes inconvenient. The court ruling against Yabloko may therefore achieve its immediate goal while creating a longer-term problem. It can keep the party off the federal ballot. It cannot remove the reasons people wanted to vote for it. It can prevent a public campaign. It cannot prevent private doubt. It can stop a rally. It cannot guarantee that the next crisis will be met with trust. The title of the story says 120 million Russians have rejected Putin's war. The evidence does not justify treating that as a confirmed statistic. But rejecting the number does not mean rejecting the underlying warning. Russia may be entering a period in which the official story and private reality move farther apart. Citizens may still fear the state. They may still support stability. They may still avoid open protest. But many are asking questions that the Kremlin cannot answer with slogans forever. Why is the war still going on? Why are the sacrifices distributed so unevenly? Why are peaceful political choices removed before voters can make them? Why does the government need to call every critic an enemy? Those questions are not a revolution. They are the beginning of political awareness. The breaking point, if it ever comes, will not be created by one party, one court decision, or one afternoon outside a Moscow building. It will come when enough people decide that silence is no longer protecting them, and when they believe they are not alone in reaching that conclusion. Until then, the Kremlin can keep managing the image of unity. It can control ballots, television, police lines, and official speeches, but it cannot fully control the memory of every lost soldier, every broken promise, every closed political door, and every family forced to choose between fear and honesty. That is the deeper story behind the protests in Moscow. Not that Russia has already revolted. Not that 120 million people have been counted in the streets. The deeper story is that a government determined to display total control may be revealing how uncertain it feels about the loyalty beneath the surface. And history has a way of turning hidden uncertainty into visible change. For now, the streets remain controlled. The courts remain aligned with the state. The election machinery remains in place. The war continues. But every controlled street, every restricted ballot, and every silenced voice carries a cost. The question is not whether the Kremlin can force people to remain silent today. The question is how long a country can remain stable when its citizens are allowed to vote, but not to choose, allowed to speak, but not to disagree, and asked to sacrifice, but not allowed to ask why. That is the real breaking point, and it may begin long before the first crowd fills the streets.